Well, here he is, the teenager's king, the man who produces all those records that your youngsters are singing and dancing to, and the same records that you're singing and dancing to in discotheques. The teenagers made him a millionaire because he really knows what's happening. The king of the fruit, the Watusi, the jerk. Here is Mr. Phil Spector.
Disclaimer. This episode discusses topics related to domestic abuse, which may be upsetting or triggering for some listeners. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, help is available. In the past 20 years, the name Phil Spector conjures up a vision of the mugshot of a man with crazy eyes, the type of eyes that reminds you of Charles Manson. It brings up the mysterious death of actress Lana Clarkson, and people discussing his history of being a madman. But there was more to Phil Spector than the headlines of the early 21st century. His legacy as a musician, songwriter, and producer have left an indelible imprint in rock and pop music. His legacy is complex. Spector changed the way that music was produced, influencing musicians like the Beatles and Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. His defining music production technique, called the Wall of Sound, is heard on records from the 60s by artists such as the Crystals, the Ronettes, the Righteous Brothers, and Ike and Tina Turner. But beyond the death of actress Lana Clarkson and a subsequent conviction for a murder lies stories of Spector's genius and stories of his controlling and erratic behavior. His influence over music echoes through to today's pop music. Artists like Taylor Swift, Amy Winehouse, The Killers, and Lana Del Rey utilize the sounds and techniques created by Phil Spector to create these larger-than-life emotional songs with a timeless sound. Can we separate the genius from the madman? Can we listen to songs like Be My Baby and enjoy the song, knowing that the songwriter and producer held the singer Ronnie Spector captive in an abusive relationship that she ultimately had to escape like a prison inmate, fleeing the compound barefoot? These are the questions we ask and explore. I'm Lorne, and on Everything is Gray, we delve into the societal impact of artists and individuals who have profoundly influenced our lives. We strive to reconcile their contributions with their actions and beliefs. To see where the genius and controlling behavior began, let's start by jumping into the early life of Phil Spector. Spector was born in 1939 or 1940, depending on the source, to Russian immigrants Benjamin and Bertha. The family's name was originally Spector, spelled with a K. They anglicized their name, like many immigrants, and replaced the K with a C. He was born Harvey Philip Spector. He had a sister who was born 5 years before him, who absolutely adored Phil. Growing up in the streets of the Bronx in the 1940s impacted him in the way that it impacted many other kids at the time. He became sort of the streetwise kid getting into gang fights, which I'm picturing a lot like West Side Story, only with more rock throwing and less dancing. On April 20th, 1949, Phil's childhood would be abruptly ended when his father took his own life. He did this by feeding carbon monoxide back into his running vehicle several blocks away from his home in New York. Prior to this suicide, there were money worries that was typical of pretty much every family in the Bronx at the time. The gravestone for Phil's father read, Ben Spector, father, husband. To know him was to love him, something that would stick in Phil's mind for the future. A few years after his father's death, his family would move to West Hollywood. Losing a parent to suicide at that young of an age can have a traumatic impact on a child's life and their future mental health, particularly at a time when there weren't any real support mechanisms in place. Bertha supposedly tried to shield her son to his father's cause of death. If this is true, then finding out the real cause of death in later years can create trust issues with his mother and potentially women in the future. Phil's world in Hollywood lacked a male figure and a role model in his life. This could have potentially affected the way that Spector eventually viewed the women in his life. Men learn to treat women the way they see their father treat their mothers, and after the age of 6, Spector never had that. While attending Fairfax High School, Phil took up playing the guitar. After his graduation, Phil went on to form a band called the Teddy Bears. This was in the mid to late 1950s when rock and roll was taking the country by storm. The Teddy Bears consisted of Spector, Carol Connors, and Spector's high school friend, Marshall Lieb. Their first recording was the song that Phil had written titled, To Know Him Is to Love Him. This is the phrase that was engraved onto his father's headstone. This was the song that put Phil Spector on the map. The song spent 3 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard charts and reached number 2 on the UK charts. The song has since had a long legacy. It was subsequently recorded by Bobby Vinton in 1969, by the trio of Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris in 1987, and Amy Winehouse in 2006. It's also been covered by the Beatles, only changing the title and lyrics to Know Her Is to Love Her. The Teddy Bears had a short career, but one of their other singles was crucial in the development of Phil Spector's technique that would be called the Wall of Sound. This was during the recording of the song Don't You Worry My Little Pet. Recording technology in the 1950s was fairly limited. Most recording done at that time was onto one track of a tape machine. To add tracks, you would record from one machine to another while adding other instruments or vocals. While recording this song, Spector would take the demo recording and send it back into the studio speakers while the other instruments and vocals were being recorded. The end result was a washy, thick sound that would set the stage for his future Wall of Sound. The Teddy Bears didn't last long, as Spector decided that he much preferred being behind the scenes rather than the artist. However, Carol Connors, the vocalist for the Teddy Bears, would go on to have a successful career as a songwriter, receiving an Academy Award nomination as co-writer for Gonna Fly Now, the theme to Rocky, that became the ultimate underdog triumphing song. Spector then began his career as a studio musician and producer. He wound up playing guitar breaks on the original version of On Broadway by the Drifters, although he was not the producer of the record. His guitar playing on that track is actually quite good. One of his first credits as the producer was in 1961, on the original recording of the song Twist and Shout by the Top Notes. This isn't the version that most people are familiar with, which is either the Beatles or the Isley Brothers that were released later. The Top Notes version is much more frenetic in its sound, played at a much faster tempo than the others. You'll have to track down this version on YouTube to hear it. He also began working as a songwriter for other artists at this time. It was also the notable beginning of his ill treatment of women. Spector had met a female songwriter named Beverly Ross. They formed a relationship, although sources vary as to whether or not it was a romantic relationship. Together they had come up with a guitar riff. A few months later, Ross wound up hearing that same guitar riff on the song Spanish Harlem by the artist Benny King. The songwriting credits for this song went to Phil Spector and Jerry Lieber. Lieber was half of the legendary songwriting team of Lieber and Stoller, associated with the legendary Brill Building, which housed the careers of songwriters like Carole King, Neil Diamond, Neil Sedaka, and Burt Bacharach. Beverly Ross had a career as a songwriter, penning songs for Elvis and Roy Orbison, amongst many others. Having the songwriting credit completely taken away from her by Phil Spector caused her to enter into a depression following the release of Spanish Harlem. Now, her claims aren't specifically substantiated, but it could very well be the truth. Songwriting was, and is, a brutal cutthroat business with millions of dollars on the line. We'll get into that in a whole separate episode. In 2013, Beverly Ross penned an autobiography titled, I Was the First Woman Phil Spector Killed. In 1961, Phil Spector, along with Les Sills, formed their own record label, a combination of both their first names creating Phil Les Records, that's Philles Records. A year later, Spector bought out Sills for his half of the label. One of the first artists that Spector signed to his record label was the Crystals. There's an often recited quote that's usually misattributed to Hunter S. Thompson that states, "The music business is a cruel and shallow money trench, a long plastic hallway where thieves and pimps run free and good men die like dogs." There's also a negative side. That seems like an appropriate quote for this next story. While briefly working in the A&R position for Liberty Records, Phil Spector heard Vicky Carr recording a song that Gene Pitney had written called He's a Rebel. Spector knew the song would be a hit and decided he needed the Crystals to record and release the song before Vicky Carr could. The only problem, the Crystals were on tour. For Spector, this was no problem. He literally had a girl group from California called the Blossoms record He's a Rebel in the studio. Spector then released the song as a new single from the Crystals, when literally no member of the Crystals is on this recording. So the lead vocals were performed by Darlene Love, and she deserves full credit. While touring, the song had to be performed live with a completely different sounding vocalist while the Crystals were on tour. And this wasn't just a one-time occurrence. After the success of He's a Rebel, he did the exact same thing with the song He's Sure the Boy I Love. He brought the Blossoms back and put Darlene Love in the lead singer position. This was a situation that upset Darlene Love, the Blossoms, and the Crystals.
My voice was on mostly all those lead songs, but from what he did to them, he put the Crystals' names on them, Bobby Sox and the Blue Jeans, Darlene Love. Nobody knew the difference. It was just a sound, and they listened to it, and nobody was saying, that's Darlene Love doing all that. But see, after He's a Rebel, then we did all the background for the Crystals, the Ronettes, Bobby Sox, and the Blue Jeans, and the same people did Darlene Love's background. So the sound continued to be the same.
So a quick bit of trivia. Darlene Love, the actual singer on He's a Rebel, took to acting in the 1980s. She's best known for playing Trish Murtaugh, Danny Glover's wife in the Lethal Weapon film series. Another dark release, given what we know about Phil Spector, was the 1962 song by the Crystals titled He Hit Me and it felt like a kiss. There was no irony in Phil Spector's version of the song With the Crystals. While it was written by Jerry Goffin and Carole King, based upon what their babysitter Eva Boyd told them she was subjected to, the babysitter would go on to become Little Eva, famous for recording another Goffin and King song, Locomotion. When asked why, Eva responded that he hit her because of his love for her. This is the same horrible excuse for domestic violence that has occurred since the beginning of time. The cycle of abuse, the trauma bonding, and the gaslighting, and the blame shifting. While nobody should ever find this acceptable, why Spector felt that this was an acceptable song to record and release as a single, we can only imagine that he had a different interpretation of the song. With the release of the single, it was met with controversy for obvious reasons. It never received widespread airplay and quickly faded away. Now, this song is not without those who saw value in it. Amy Winehouse covered the song and called it an inspiration for her album Back to Black. In an interview, she stated,
The Crystals had a song called He Hit Me, and it felt like a kiss. Like, that's messed up. There's only a certain percentage of people that would understand what that's about. Most people would be like, how dare you promote domestic violence? But to me, I'm like, I know what you mean. I know exactly what you mean.
Winehouse, whose relationship with her husband at the time was reported to have a mutual domestic violence component to it. Lana Del Rey included the song title as lyrics to her controversial song, Ultraviolence. In the end, Carole King even stated that she wished she'd never written that song, particularly as a victim of domestic violence herself. The most notorious professional and personal relationship with Phil Spector began when he signed the Ronettes to his record label. The Ronettes were another girl group based out of Manhattan. In 1963, looking to move beyond New York City and their current record label, they sought out Phil Spector and asked to audition for him. The group consisted of Ronnie Bennett on lead vocals, her sister Estelle Bennett, and their cousin Nedra Talley.
My sister called and asked, I guess it was his secretary or whatever, could we come down and audition to do background? And that's how we met Phil. It was at Mirror Sound, and Phil was sitting there at a piano by himself. No one was in the studio, and the three of us walked in. And he asked me the three of us a lot of questions, and what records did we grow up liking, and this and that, and who sang lead, and this and that, and I said, I did, and he said, well, let me hear you, and I sang all of Frankie Lyman stuff, of course, and Little Anthony's stuff, and where do you guys live? I said, we live up in Upper Manhattan, Spanish Harlem. He says, take me to your house now. So he took him straight to my house. My mother was there. And he said, told my mother, he said, I'm going to make your girls an #1 record. How do you like that, Mrs. Bennett?
Initially, Spector wanted to sign Ronnie Bennett as a solo artist, but her mother stepped in and told Spector that it was an all-or-nothing deal for the three young ladies. The Ronettes then signed with Phyllis Records. The first 4 songs that the Ronettes recorded with Phil Spector were covers such as The Twist, The Wah-Wah-Tusi, Hot Pastrami, and Mashed Potato Time. And guess what Phil Spector did with those recordings? He released them as songs from the Crystals once again. So many of the Crystals recordings were potentially from 3 different bands, the Crystals, the Blossoms, or the Ronettes. Fortunately, there are current compilations that rightly give appropriate credit to the Ronettes, but the Blossoms haven't fared as well. The Ronettes were finally able to achieve success. That came in the form of a song that they are best known for, Be My Baby. During the production of Be My Baby was when Spector, who was married at the time, began a fixation with the young Ronnie Bennett. When Be My Baby was released, it became a hit, reaching number 2 on the Billboard charts in the US and number 4 in the UK. This is a song that influenced generations of producers, songwriters, and artists. This song is considered to be one of the 2 pinnacles of what defined Phil Spector's wall of sound, the other being You've Lost That Loving Feeling by the Righteous Brothers.
Phil made the wall of sound because, and of course I've thought of different reasons why, we would almost never roll tape for, under 3 hours into the session. All of that time would be spent with the musicians playing and Phil listening. One of the theories that I've evolved is that the reason he did it so long was that he wanted the musicians to be tired so that they lost their individualism. And now what they played could be blended into this sound.
One particular incident that stands out in my mind is when Phil came out to California to record Be My Baby. Well, one interesting thing happened. I was out in the room where the musicians were playing, and there was a lot of mistakes out there. There was a lot of imperfection out there. And I thought, oh boy, they sure haven't got this time. You've got a room full of 36 guys, and half of them are making mistakes. And I thought, how's he ever going to make this into a smash? But then I walked back into the booth, and Phil said, wait until you hear what I got. And I heard it coming back, and it was a miracle. It was glorious. And I said, but I just heard a bunch of mistakes. He says, never mind what's really out there. Listen to what I got in here. And that's where the magic came. Between the wires and the booth, Phil got magic. He caught lightning in a bottle, time and time again.
So what is the wall of sound that Phil Spector created? The wall of sound consisted of layers of instruments. Oftentimes, multiple musicians would play the exact same musical line, creating a sound that would punch through on the AM radio. There was heavy reverb or ambience recorded as well as echo. It would create this almost symphonic type sound, harkening back to when Spector grew up listening to classical music. Be My Baby had a tremendous influence on another major producer, songwriter, and singer, Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys. He described it by saying,
"Yeah, Be My Baby is my favorite song. It was in 1963. I was driving down the street with my girlfriend, Judy, and it came on the radio, and after about 30 seconds of it, I said, what is this? And I pulled over to the side of the road, and we're sitting there going, what? Listen to this record, you know? It was like a sound experience, a wall of sound.
Brian Wilson further stated, when I first heard it, I started analyzing every part of the track, how the bass line interlocked with the drums, how the vocals floated over the orchestra. I wanted to make records like that. Spector's production on that sound influenced Wilson's production of the Beach Boys' masterpiece, Pet Sounds. He utilized many of the same backing musicians, known in later years as the Wrecking Crew, in making that record. It had the same lush sound with layered instruments. Let's hear Phil Spector talk about Be My Baby and its effect on Brian Wilson.
Ask Brian Wilson what it's like to get the Spector around. He's still, at age 65, going through craziness. Dreaming playing Be My Baby every morning, he writes in his articles and interviews, trying to figure out how I got to Be My Baby. 40 years later, you know, dreaming how I got to Be My Baby sound. You know, going crazy. You know, figuring out, I mean, he's a little cuckoo over it. You know, he smoked, I like to have a nickel for every joint he smoked, trying to figure out how I got to Be My Baby sound. You know, he's demented about it. I love him, but I was his Dr. Moriarty, you know, his mentor. He thought he was in a race with me. I was never in a race with him. I always wondered how it took two people to write Little Dude's Coupe.
The ripple effect from the songwriting and production of Be My Baby carries on through the 21st century. The drums were interpolated by producer Rick Nowels on Lana Del Rey's song Born to Die. After the success of Be My Baby, the darkness inside of Phil Spector would begin to emerge, focusing on his obsession with Ronnie Bennett. During the recording of Be My Baby, Phil Spector began to develop an obsession with Bennett, and she in turn found herself falling for Phil.
I think because his feeling for me was so strong at the very beginning, and mine for him, that's when he started writing the love songs. I mean, like you said, Do I Love You, Be My Baby, Baby I Love You, because I think it was the love he had for me and the love I had for him. That's what showed on the record. Shortly after the Ronettes had signed with Phyllis Records, Ronnie had begun an affair with Spector. This was shortly after Phil had married his first wife, Annette, in 1963. The affair continued through Phil's divorce from Annette in 1966. In 1968, Phil Spector and Ronnie Bennett married, and from that point on, through her death in 2022, she became known as Ronnie Spector. It was at this time that Phil's controlling nature over women continued to surface. He began to hamper the career of the Ronettes in 1964, likely because he wanted to keep control over the popularity of the group. They even wound up recording songs, and then he would sit on the recordings. At the beginning of 1964, Phil had the Ronettes record the song Chapel of Love. However, he sat on that recording. The song was then released a few months later, recorded by the Dixie Cups, who recorded their own version with Lieber and Stoller producing for their own record label. Ronnie Spector surmised that Phil was trying to keep the Ronettes from becoming too popular. He certainly stifled the career of Ronnie Spector while the Ronettes were growing in popularity. You can hear Ronnie in her own words talk about how controlling Phil Spector was with regards to jealousy, particularly when it came to other musicians.
But he was afraid that he would lose you to rock and roll?
You're damn right. He thought he'd lose me to a whole lot more than rock and roll. I mean, you know, guys and stuff. He was very insecure, so.
Even of Elvis Presley?
Yes, which one, that's the only person he ever let me, he took me to see his show. It was on my birthday, every August 10th. He sent me to Las Vegas, but I usually went with a bodyguard. But this time he went because it was Elvis's compliments, you know, to come. And we went, and I was in that room for no longer than a minute when Phil called. Because Elvis may have looked at me a little too soon or a little too fast or a little too long. My ex-husband called me over and said, here, it's $500, happy birthday, go upstairs and play blackjack, we gotta talk business. There was like 25 people in the room. I was like, talk business. You know? Even then, I didn't get a chance to like rap with the rock stars or, you know, get a chance to meet any. And that was the only show I ever saw, a rock show.
The Rolling Stones were our opening act in England. And we were on the bus, and they never spoke to us. I said, what's going on? We wondered why these guys weren't speaking to us. So I went over to Andrew Oldham, which was their manager at the time. I said, hey, how come you guys are so cold? Is this supposed to be England? They said, no, honey, Phil Spector sent us a telegram saying, don't talk to you guys. I said, you gotta be kidding. He's crazy. And then we made friends.
In 1966, the Ronettes had the opportunity to open for the Beatles on their tour of the US. Phil wouldn't allow Ronnie to tour with the Beatles. He required her to stay with him. The Ronettes eventually used Ronnie's cousin Elaine to take her place during the tour. Shortly after that, the Ronettes' rising star began to fade. Music tastes were changing from the poppy-sounding girl groups to the more organic-sounding rock music, like Creedence Clearwater Revival and the Rolling Stones and Jimi Hendrix. This pushed Ronnie further under Spector's control, where he would brainwash her into believing she was nothing without him. After the tour with the Beatles, the Ronettes would cease operating as a group in 1967. Ronnie herself saw her career stall. Phil wouldn't let her perform live, and her solo recordings were limited. The only release Ronnie was able to put out was a single titled, You Came, You Saw, You Conquered, a fitting title to have Ronnie sing at the direction of Phil Spector. The release of the song was credited to the Ronettes despite not featuring any of the other members. The lyrics of the song, co-written by Phil, certainly has lyrics that would sum up their relationship at the time, at least the way Phil Spector saw it. Throughout the remainder of their marriage, Phil Spector pretty much kept Ronnie captive in his LA mansion. According to Ronnie, she was rarely allowed out of the house. On the rare times that she was allowed out, she had to drive around with a mannequin designed to look like Phil, so people would think she wasn't alone. This is a mannequin that even had a cigarette in its mouth. Listen to Ronnie talk about what it was like in this 1991 interview from Inside Edition.
I was in love. I had the man that wrote my hit records. He owned the record company. I loved everything about him.
Why did it become a nightmare?
He didn't let me sing. It was like the worst thing that could have happened to me. It gradually, the gates were up and the barbed wire, and I found myself in a prison. I couldn't get out. The doors were locked from the inside. And he had an inflatable man, actually. They looked exactly like him. All of Phil's clothes. He had on a hat like, all these were Phil's actual, his clothes, his shirt, his pants, and he put a cigarette in his mouth and the whole bit. I mean, it looked exactly like Phil. And I had to go, if I went out for 20 minutes, I had to take Phil with me.
He threatened you?
Oh, yes. I mean, that's several times.
He said, I'm going to kill you.
If you leave, I'm going to kill you. I got totally drunk one night, and I woke up in a sanitarium. And I got to do things that I never could have done in that house. And I made my plan, like every other month, I'd purposely get drunk so I could get out of there and be in a sanitarium so I could see the outside world. I mean, to be in a sanitarium and like that more than you like your married life.
Phil Spector even told Ronnie that he had a cold-topped coffin ready for her so he could, quote, keep an eye on her after she's dead. Some of these stories come across like a dark comedy, but they're very real. Phil actually got Ronnie 6-year-old twin boys as a gift.
I was in the sanitarium, and I came home that day, and he took me to a park, and he said, you see those 2 kids over there, you like them? And they were, mind you, 6 years old, almost 6 at the time. And I said, they're adorable, and that's all I said. And when I got back to the mansion, they were out in front playing around the fountain. He said, happy birthday.
This gift, of course, was just another means to manipulate and control Ronnie. That is, control beyond the threats of violence. It's similar to giving your victim a pet to keep them from leaving. Using a child or a pet can be leveraged to pressure the victim into believing that if you leave, you'll never see this dog or this child again. Phil Spector's abuse wasn't just limited to Ronnie, but it also applied to their children as well. One of the twins discussed their time living with Phil.
We were adopted into the family with the intention that we would keep her prolonged into the family. We were meant to be shackles for Ronnie, but it didn't work. Go to school, come back from school, get locked up back in our room again until dinner, come back down, eat dinner, no talking, go back upstairs and locked up.
Just 6 months after Phil surprised Ronnie with twin sons, Ronnie made her escape.
I had on no shoes, and I went down that hill, and once I got beyond those gates, I knew I was free. And I actually started jogging. I didn't walk out of here. I was running out of here. I was trying to save my life.
Their divorce, as you can imagine, was very contentious. In Phil's criminal trial decades later, Ronnie testified that Phil threatened to have her killed if she didn't agree to the divorce settlement. She said he told her, I'll kill you. I'll have a hitman kill you. The end result was that Ronnie received $25,000, a used car, and $2,500 a month for the next 5 years. At times, it's claimed that Phil required her to forfeit her rights to all future royalties, but Ronnie clarified that it did not. After the divorce, Phil's rage and controlling nature was focused on their 3 adopted children. Phil had reportedly told the children that Ronnie had abandoned them and didn't love them. In the same way that Ronnie was confined to the house, their children would be held captive there as well. In a 2010 interview, she stated, "I wanted my kids, but Phil wouldn't let me have them. He knew that was the way to hurt me the most." The Ronettes wound up filing a lawsuit against Phil Spector for unpaid royalties, also seeking ownership of the master recordings. However, due to the contract they had originally signed with Spector, they ultimately didn't prevail in court. After her divorce, Ronnie Spector was able to rebuild her career. In 1985, she was an uncredited featured vocalist on Eddie Money's hit Take Me Home Tonight, where she interpolates the line "Be My Little Baby" from Be My Baby. Of course, this required Phil Spector to receive songwriting credits and money every single time the song is played. She was legendary for her Christmas concerts that she would play every single year in New York City. In the end, Ronnie was ultimately able to find happiness. She married a man named Jonathan Greenfield and they had 2 children together. She then stated, "Jonathan gave me the strength to sing again and be happy." But the same can't be said for all the women that Spector came across. In part 2 of this episode, we'll talk about Phil Spector's career resurgence working with the Beatles, George Harrison, Leonard Cohen, and the Ramones, followed by a period of seclusion during the 1980s, culminating in the ill-fated evening when 40-year-old Lana Clarkson drew her last breath in front of Phil Spector. I'm Lorne with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. Part 2 will be out next week. This episode was written and produced by Lorne Bregenzer. This episode is dedicated to all victims of domestic abuse.